Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Pat Brown. Whether you are a U.S. or non-U.S. company, you are faced with an extraordinary amount of change, here and globally. Today, we're going to focus on how the shifts in taxes, tariffs, and immigration policies in the markets are affecting inbound companies. And joining me to get into this topic are Craig Stronberg and Wade Sutton. Craig, Wade, welcome.
Good to be here.
Okay, so before we get into the details, just based on what you're hearing, how are businesses feeling about the landscape right now? Craig, maybe I'll start with you.
So what I would say is the phrase that I'm hearing a lot is like the search for stability.
Yeah.
Like in many ways, stable
Right.
is as good as you can get.
Yes.
And if you can get your business to stable,
Yep.
which used to be just so-so,
Right.
now you're in the golden circle.
Right, exactly. That used to be table stakes, but now it's
and now it's actually
the
you're
goal
doing
that
pretty
we're trying
well
to
in
get
this
to.
environment if you can get stability.
Yep. Wade, how about you?
Yeah, I think you look at the macro picture, the data has been surprising. You would have gone back 6-9 months ago, and with some of the labor restrictions and the tariffs, there are a lot of economists predicting that we're going to see some pretty significant hits to GDP.
Right.
We're seeing the opposite right now with pretty robust growth. It's hard to figure out why that's happening. I think, data center construction, AI, that might be part of the story. But the economy seems pretty strong.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you, Wade, somewhat surprising. Now, to your point, Craig, on stability, the tax law changes delivered a lot of stability that businesses have been searching for. But you look across the rest of the landscape and maybe that stability is not really quite as apparent. And so that's an issue. But to your point, Wade, despite some of this instability, the economy seems to be powering ahead. Lots and lots of capital investment from lots of companies, despite all the turmoil. So I know this is frequently a tax-related discussion, Craig, but to come back to you, let's talk about some non-tax stuff, right? So I mentioned in the opening tariffs, immigration policy, issues like that, geopolitical risk, obviously wars around the world. How do non-U.S. headquartered companies think about that landscape as we focus on them in particular as they assess investments in the United States versus investments outside the United States, et cetera? How are they kind of factoring these non-tax elements into the equation?
So I'm lucky today because the prep that I had for this was a conversation about an hour ago with a bunch of European and UK businesses.
Okay.
This was basically the conversation, right? These are heavy investors from an inbound point of view in the US.
Right.
Many of them in the manufacturing technology space. This is the conversation they're having.
Yep.
What we tried to get across to them is that, look, for many decades, for most of their careers, for most of our careers, understanding the US has been very easy because it's a predictable and a stable market.
Right.
In many ways, it still is.
Yeah.
Right, but there are other parts of the regulatory space that are increasingly unpredictable and unstable look, it's our job to understand it.
Right.
And, we're keeping up with it. If you're sitting
as best as we can.
As best as we can. But if you're sitting in Kuala Lumpur or Tokyo, or Canberra, it's harder.
Yes.
And so they're having a harder time understanding the rapidity of change.
Yes.
They're also having a harder time understanding the changes in national governance. Right, the concentration of power in the executive.
Right.
Where does the judiciary play? Where does the legislative play? So I think they are having to continuously understand regulatory change in the U.S. and how it impacts their inbound investment to a degree many of them have not had to deal with before. And it doesn't mean that inbound investment is necessarily going down, but it means they're having to do a lot more diligence and a lot more homework and create a lot more contingency planning when they do that investment.
Right. So we saw a great example of this, Craig, just following up on that. Just over the last few days, President Trump makes an announcement on social media with respect to a significant change in tariff policy affecting the pharmaceutical sector. And what does this mean? It's a social media post, but what does that tell us about what direction we're actually going? Hour after hour is then spent trying to dissect that, trying to follow up with folks in the White House. To your point, we're here in Washington. We're able to sort of do that kind of real time, whereas folks halfway around the world are trying to figure this out from halfway around the world, making it all the more challenging. So Wade, let's go back to our little corner of the world of tax. Yeah. So OB3 has obviously made some significant changes, again, focusing on non-US headquartered companies. Is the environment now more attractive? Are we seeing inbound companies react to that, or is it still too soon to tell?
It's still early days, but I think we have a much more stable environment. We now have permanent tax policy where a lot of these provisions are not going to expire after a period of time. The incentives have been tweaked significantly. So now a lot of our old instincts you just have to throw out the window. So for example, a lot of people are looking at bringing IP back to the US or increasing investment in US R&D activity. And even things like, it used to be near malpractice if you had a merger of equals that you'd use a US top company.
Right.
That intuition is flipped. So I think from a tax perspective, at least, it's a stable, attractive environment.
Yeah. Push a little bit deeper on that, Wade. So think about the environment around incentives, credits, the R&D credit, but also changes to FDII. Then I look at the green energy landscape. That took a bit of a hit in OB3. How is the inbound community assessing the totality of all that?
Yeah, I think at least for the moment, we know what the rules are. Yeah. The big X factor there, I think, you mentioned all those credits and incentives. Right. There are some minimum taxes floating out.
Quite a few.
Around there. In the US, we have our CAMT. Yeah. There's been a little bit of friction as people are figuring out that they might owe CAMT or not get as much FDII benefit as they used to model. And then globally, there's a big question about Pillar 2. And if you invest in the United States, how will Pillar 2 interact with that? I'm hearing a lot of optimism about this G7 side-by-side agreement. Obviously, that hasn't landed, but I think folks are waiting to see what happens.
Yeah. One of the things that's come out in some of the conversations I've been having with companies, both inbound and outbound companies, is to your point about the interaction of these provisions, minimum taxes and things in the United States, trying to tease out what's a one-time effect versus what's structural. Because if you're going to make 5, 10, 15-year investment decisions, you need to understand your structural rate and what are the things that are going to be there. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with policy stability, but it also has to do with understanding your own facts and how these very complicated interlocked set of provisions are going to be applied on your own facts. And right now, I think companies are optimistic, from what I can tell, but also really facing a lot of challenges in trying to get down to the depth and the details of how these things interact together. So Craig, let's look ahead a little bit. When we think about, upcoming U.S. tax changes or frankly other changes, where should non-U.S. headquartered companies be focusing their attention? And I guess you could say everywhere, but I'm not going to give you that cop-out answer. So if you had to pick a couple of areas where the inbound community should be following more closely, what would you focus on?
So coming into the administration, I thought we would see even more spikes in protectionist policy.
Yeah.
But some of the early executive orders in the first couple of weeks hinted at that.
Sure.
And there's pretty consistent protectionist policy growth from Trump 1 through Biden into Trump 2, right? Those two administrations agree on a lot of protectionist policy. I thought there would be more.
Yeah.
Based on what I'm hearing on policy on demand, right? Congress has stepped back a little bit now that the bigger bills are done. Let's see what happens after the next Congress is seated. Yeah. There certainly is an appetite on the Hill to do more protectionist policy.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is going to be at the top of his agenda by that point, but you could easily see some of the things that he hinted at, like more export controls and a new export control entity, further strengthening of CFIUS and inbounds investors. Other things of that nature could come to birth beyond executive order.
Okay.
I'm sort of looking at the next Congress to see, is that something that inbounds investors are going to have to deal with or not? And at this point, I don't think we know.
Yep. So our crystal ball is a little hazy at the moment.
Hazy, but I don't think that companies should be lax about waiting for that point to figure out if that did come to pass, what would we do? Because at some point, it probably is.
Wade, how about you? Look around the corner. What should companies be looking for?
Particularly for inbounds, I mentioned the G7 agreement.
Yeah.
If that falls apart, we could be back in a world where $8.99, the revenge tax, is back on the table. And I think that makes domestic U.S. investment really unattractive. And you saw that in the revenue score that we got from JCT, that it was actually negative in the out years because of foreign disinvestment. So I think people are watching that very closely.
Yeah. Yeah, that will be an area. And that is one, unlike Craig, to your point, you're looking further ahead to the next Congress. We should know a lot more about this G7 agreement over the next 3 or 4 months, realistically. Okay, guys, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much to both of you for your insights.
Thank you.
And thank you for spending this time with us. Take care.